George Gopen here. We arrive at the beginning of the fifth and last movement of T.S. Eliot's extraordinary poem, The Wasteland. I don't know how long it's going to take me to talk about it. Probably 2 to 3 hours, maybe more. Eliot wrote this entire section in one afternoon. That's very unusual for him. He usually hacked away at things over and over and over again and put them away and brought them back out. And this just came pouring out one afternoon. And Ezra Pound, in looking at Eliot's manuscript, Pound, who had done so much work on all the rest of it, I mean, the fourth movement was 75 or 80 lines long, and Pound got rid of all but 8 of them. Pound indicated that this last movement was pretty good. He didn't have to do very much. Could be that Pound just got tired of editing The Wasteland. Or it could be that Eliot, in his more free-flowing mind of creation, was not hitting some of the problems that he usually hit. He also was interested in doing fairly short sections to try to wrap up stuff he'd been talking about for the 4 previous movements. Now, there are 8 or 10 of these sections, depending on how you define the sections. So there were a bunch of them, but at no time was he writing more than just a stanzagraph before he moved on to something somewhat disjointed from what he had before. The 5th movement he entitled, What the Thunder Said. Now, this comes from a long passage in one of the Hindu Upanishads. And it begins, let me get the text up here for you. What the thunder said. It begins with these, what is that? 2, 4, 6, 9 lines that have a beginning and end to them. We know this because if you look at the next section, can't show you the space. There's a space between the last moment of this last line and the first line of the next. I'm going to read this passage without emotion or interpretation. Just let's get the words out there, and then we can see what he has done with them. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who are living are now dying with a little patience. What's it all about? Painting a picture, it seems, and we have 3 afters to start the first 3 lines. After, we've got torchlight that is red on sweaty faces. The light is red, it's fire, and maybe it's flaming red on the sweaty faces. Then after the frosty silence in the garden, the frosty is different from the red fire in the sweaty, and it's silence. Sweaty faces don't betoken sound particularly, but they don't betoken silence. After the frosty silence in the gardens, that may be the next step in time, and we're in a garden somewhere. After the agony in stony places. Okay, now anybody who is into the stories of the Gospels may have memory flicked by stony places. What is the place of stones? We have Golgotha. We have Gethsemane, which is a garden. Is this the next to last moment, next to last movement in the life of Christ. Could be. The shouting and the crying, well, that would happen after Jesus was betrayed and taken and imprisoned. The shouting and the crying, prison, and then he was tried in the palace. And the reverberation of thunder, of spring, comes after the crucifixion. The 9th hour he is crucified, and then the earth shakes. Reverberation of thunder of spring, and remember this whole poem started in the spring, over distant mountains. Mountains. Look at the cinematography of these lines. And so I'm keeping this text up in front of you. Sweaty faces. That's a close-in shot on a face. Frosty silence in the gardens. It's a closed-in space that's a garden, but it's a space, not a face. The agony in stony places, those are larger places than gardens, and they extend for a long way. And then we turn to sound, shouting, and worse sound, crying. And then we get prison and palace and reverberation, the two P's of prison and palace talking to each other. A closed-in prison, a larger palace, the concept of reverberation, spreading out in distance, reverberation of thunder, enjambement for the first time. We have to cross over to the next line because the grammar insists we do so. Prison and palace and reverberation of thunder, of spring, over, over, of thunder, of spring, over distant mountains. We have gotten as far away as we can get. And then we have he. It sounds like the grammatical subject of this sentence. After, he who was living is now dead. That fits in with the moment after the crucifixion, does it not? We who were living are now dying. Now, if you make that a line end, that's strange. I thought his death was going to have something to do with our living beyond our dying, are now dying with maybe a enjambement. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a friction between the two, are dying with a little patience. Now, what is this patience? This whole passage has been written in a crescendo and maybe an accelerando as well. It builds and builds and builds and builds. We get to the mountains, and then we have a different 3 lines. He who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. And we end very quietly. What if we read it like that? What if we put those dynamics into the performance of the passage? Then we get something like this, very different from my first reading. Let me bring that text up again. How different this is from the previous reading. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. Wow. And look, faces at the first line rhymes with places in the third line. But gardens doesn't rhyme with crying. But crying does rhyme with dying. So there are two rhymes, but only two rhymes. That's enough to convince me that it ought to be read like that, because that's how I see and hear the lines functioning. Now you go listen to Mr. Eliot read it. You can do on YouTube or other places. And he reads the whole poem like this, no matter what else is going on. Maybe he doesn't want to interpret it for us. Maybe he's not very musical as a performer. He certainly was interested in music. So maybe he's hiding something, maybe he just can't do it. But this is what the lines seem to me to do. And there's another progression that's interesting. Let me bring up another graphic for you. The numbers in the left column are the number of beats in each line after the torchlight red on sweaty faces is 5 beats. After the frosty silence in the gardens is 5 beats. After the agony in stony places is 4 beats. The shouting and the crying is 2 beats. Now, in general, as a careful reader, not conscious of what's happening where this is concerned, if we have a line that has 5 beats, that becomes an expectation that maybe the next line was going to have 5 beats. Then if we get another line with 5 beats, we've got 5 in our head, in our ear, in our mind, as the default value expectation of how long a line takes and how much is going on with it. And therefore, if we get a line with only 4, there's a little bit more emphasis on each of the 4. They spread out as if to occupy the space, the weight, the sound, the dignity of a 5-beat line. Then if we go to 2, wow. If we'd gone to 3, it would have been 5, 5, 4, 3, and we go to 2. But 5, 5, 4, 2. So that line, the shouting and the crying, is noisier just because it has 2 beats as opposed to the 4 that preceded it. And then what do? We go back to 4. Presence and places and reverberations. And then 4 again, a thunder of spring over distant mountains. And then 4 again, he who was living is now dead. And then 4 again, we who were living are now dying. And then once again, the dramatic declension from 4 to 2. With a little patience. It's really all that going on. Yeah, I think it is. Now, it's not going on for every reader, and certainly if you read it fast enough, or you read it without hearing it, those beats are unlikely to do anything for you, but they are there. Now, if they were only here, and not in the rest of the poem doing interesting things, I would say, well, yeah, I'm protesting too much. But when Eliot is careful, every time he moves from 4-beat lines to 2-beat lines, and every time it makes a difference, something happens as a result, when you can see it on the page, a 4-beat unit, 2-beat units. If he goes from 4 to 2 in the middle of a unit like this, I say, it adds to the party that's going on. That says grow, 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 grow. Less, less, little. And we have the word little in that last line, with a little patience. Patience is the last word. Patience, is that a literary allusion? Young. In this poem, in the context of this poem, what Eliot's been doing all the way through, it's a literary allusion if you can hear it. Very few people can hear it because it's not a long enough section. Patience. How can patience be that important? Because it's one of the most important words to guess who? Wagner? No, he was mostly used. Dante? Chaucer? Shakespeare? Very good. Shakespeare, patience is really important. It's astonishingly important. For Shakespeare, there is an emotional spectrum. At the bottom is despair. Despair is the lack of hope. And if you don't have hope, there's nowhere you can go from there. Despair is when you are at the absolute worst. Now in King Lear, the storm having raged, onto the stage comes Edgar, the good guy who's been turned out and defrauded and disowned, and he's wearing nothing but a breech clout, and he's been out in this horrible storm, and he's taken on the character of a madman, poor Tom of Bedlam. And he comes out and has a little soliloquy in which he says essentially, this is the worst. And when he finishes his little soliloquy, onto the stage comes his 80-year-old father, being led by an even older man, and his father has just been forcibly and violently blinded. And when that scene is over, Edgar says, you never can say, this is the worst. Because if you say it, it indicates you have some hope. This is the worst. It can't get any worse than this. And hope means you're not at the worst. So despair, a state of lack of hope, is the bottom of Shakespeare's emotional spectrum. What's the top? Not ecstasy. Patience. Patience is what, if you can strive for it and achieve it, you are at the emotional top. Now, Shakespeare really cared about evening out the big emotions that are positive and the big emotions that are negative. Because if you don't go so positive here, you won't go so negative over here. We find it all over his plays. There's this wonderful line in King Richard II, in which John of Gaunt is visiting his sister-in-law, the Duchess, and the Duchess's husband has been killed by Richard. And Gaunt says, I just don't understand how you can deal with this with so much patience. And she says in one glorious iambic pentameter line, call it not patience, Gaunt, it is despair. And you see the two look very similar from a distance. In both cases, you do nothing. Here because you can't get up the energy to do anything. And here because your doing of anything is beside the matter. And then there is that wonderful scene in King Lear, before the storm scene, where he has gone to live with one of his 2 very nasty daughters. And he has put aside a provision that he gets to take 100 of his men with him. They represent his power. He can exert his control. They represent his masculinity. And the first sister he goes to, throws him out basically. And he goes to the second one and says, Reagan, I'm going to come stay with you. And she says, okay, but I really don't want those 100 men. I haven't got room for them. I haven't got a big place like my sister. Goneril, so if you come here, 50. And then the bargaining goes on. He said, I made provision for 100. And the bargaining ends like this. Sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Here we have it. I'll go with thee, Lear says to Goneril. Goneril threw him out and said, don't want your 100, take 50. And Reagan says, 25 is all I'll take. Sorry for that. I'll go with thee, thy 50, yet doth double 5 and 20, and thou art twice her love. Goneril says, hear me, my lord. What need you 5 and 20? 10 or 5 to follow in a house where twice so many have command to tend you? And Reagan, the nastier sister, who's always one-upping her sister, says, what need 1? And Lear explodes. What need 1? Oh, reason not the need. Our basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is cheap as beasts. Thou art a lady, if only to go warm were gorgeous. Why, nature needs not what thou, gorgeous, wearest, which scarcely keeps thee warm. But for true need, you heavens, give me that patience. Patience. Wow. What need 5 and 20? What need 10? What need 5? What need 1? Reason not the need. If we could reason about need, nobody needs any more than the pair necessities. And he jibes at her for wearing so little. Clothes are supposed to keep you warm because she's doing it to be gorgeous and it doesn't keep her warm. For real need, you heavens, grant me patience. Patience, I need. That is a necessity. Without it, all the rest of life fails to hold. Nothing's changed. So we go back to our text. Shouting, crying, prison, bells, reverberation, thunder, spring, distant mountains. He who is living is now dead. Saviors died. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. It's a problematic line. We who are living and now dying, is this post-World War I syndrome? Is this the whole culture after World War I? And is the problem that we have too little patience? We only have a little patience? Or will our dying be over and we will be dead when we run out of patience altogether? But here is another reverberation of Shakespeare, just like the word nothing. which you'll recognize as being one of Shakespeare's favorite words only when you've read a lot of Shakespeare. Oh, and some lecturer tells you. And the same is true for patience. So we've had this scene of the passion of the Christ reduced to snapshots, and we move on with a little patience. This next passage, I'll bring it up. Is too long for any one page of graphics to show you, but it is such a unified passage. I want to read it for you from beginning to end. Here it is. Here is no water, but only rock. Rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain mouth of carrier's teeth that cannot spit, here one can neither stand nor lie nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and the dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock, where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. The wasteland started out as a brown land with cracks. What are the roots that clutch in this stony land? It's true we've had the other end of it. We've been told to fear death by water, and we've experienced death by water in movement forward. But the wasted land is the land that is infertile, that may well not bloom again in spring. We don't bury or drown our fertility gods. Who knows if water will ever come back? And there is a sound of desperation in the passage I just read you. You know, if there were waters, if there were only the sound of water, if there and the but there is no water. Now, what Eliot is using here throughout some of this passage, especially to start with, is an ancient Greek rhetorical figure of speech whose name you may never have heard before, but whose experience you've had any number of times. It's called epanalepsis. There you have it. Spelled E, P-A-N, epan. Lepsis, L-E-P-S-I-S, epanalepsis. And it's simply the beginning of a new unit with a word that ended the preceding unit. So if you get blah, 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 water, and the next unit starts off water, then you have epanalepsis. And especially if you have it over and over again, let's bring up the text and see it at work. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Fine. On we go. If there were water, and a rock. If there were rock, epenlepsis, and also water, epenlepsis, and a spring, a pool, kind of epenlepsis is not the same word, but it's the same body of water among the rock. And if there were the sound of water, only not the cicada and the dry grass singing. All right, so epenlepsis does what? It winds us in the mountains. We're up there in the mountains and we can't find things going on. Now, if you look at the length of the lines, we've got a change. And let me look at that change for you. How many beats, bum, 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 have we got here? Well, I've done a little schema for you on that. Let's bring it up. We've seen it before. This middle column is the passage I was at the beginning, the first half of the passage, the long passage I read you. And take a look. 4 beats, 4 beats, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 7. Well, look at that 7. 6, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Now these 5s sound more than all those 4s. So 4, contain, 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 have patience, explode, come down, but still too many, come down, but still too many, stay there, stay there, stay there, stay there. And the last part of this 5 is a 2. Oh, come on. How do you know the last 2 of that 5 are a 2 by themselves? Well, let's go back to the text. 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. Here's the 7. Dead mountain, mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit. Teeth cannot spit. Back to 6. Here one can neither stand or lie nor sit. Much longer than 4. There is not even silence in the mountains. 5. But dry, sterile thunder without rain. 5. There is not even solitude in the mountains. 5. But red, sullen faces sneer and snarl. 5. From doors of mud-cracked houses. 4. No. From doors of mud-cracked houses is 3. And there is, if there were water. Now see, it starts in the middle of the line. It starts in the middle of the line because it finishes off this line. So it has 5 beats. From doors of mud, cracked houses, if there were water. But the last 2 beats are separated from the first 3. And then we get a much shorter progression of lines. So if we go back to our number of beats per line graphic, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 7, 6, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, go to 2. Look at what the last half of that passage is. 2, 2, 2. You hear how more desperate it can become with just the 2s? 2, 2, 2, 2, even more desperate. 1, 1. Expand. 1, 2, 3. Expand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 2. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 2. Let's go back to the text and see how that sounds, because it has a sound to it. Start here. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. These are the 5s. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. The extra 2, if there were water. Now, and no rock. If there were rock, twos, and also water. Now ones and water. A spring, getting desperate. A pool among the rock, up to 3. If there were the sound of water, only 5. Not the cicada, 2. And dry grass singing, 3. A pool among the rock, 3. If there were the sound of water, only 5. Not the cicada, 2. The dry grass singing, 3. But sound of water over a rock, 4. Where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, 5. Drip, drop, drip, drop, drop, drop. 7. Too much for its own weight. And it evaporates. It disintegrates. But there is no water. Wow. How did we get there? So what we have here is an explosion of dryness. If you just read this poem as if it were prose, and you didn't take any notice of line lengths or rhythms or sounds or rhetorical figures of speech, which you can recognize even if you don't know their names, then this is a strange thing to read. No fun, and of what use? And the water and the rock, make up your mind, in the mountains, if they're on the sound of water, But as we wander around the mountains on these roads with the rocks and the no water, and the number of beats keep pulling us, if we get crescendos that go nowhere but collapse, if we do as much as we can to expand and then collapse, every once in a while we get something visual. Red sullen faces sneer and snarl. Now, in the first stanza graph, we had that torchlight red on sweaty faces. And here we have red sullen faces, sneer and snarl. What comes to my mind, and I have no idea if this was in Eliot's ken at all, my favorite artist is Hieronymus Bosch, Bosch, that medieval Flemish guy who showed us horrors, the horrors of hell, indeed, that are so striking that once you've seen them, even if you can't get to the Prado in Madrid and see them in person, which I urge you to do. I once went to Madrid 52 years ago just to see the Bosch. I got out of the plane at the airport. I didn't have a long time. I got into a cab. I went to the Prado. I spent 2 hours standing in front of the several Bosch paintings. I got back in the cab. I went to the airport and continued my travel. It is worth that kind of an interruption in life. But just pull them up online. The garden, the earthly delights will do it for you. And they'll show you details and large things. You'll see these red sullen faces sneer and snarl. And you'll see what kind of a hell that is. And this is a kind of hell Eliot is painting for us. So we try to get water, and we get intense about it, narrowing the line. We even get down to 1 beat lines, water, the spring, anything. But there is no water. What we come to then is a wholly different sound. You see a change of stanza graph. We've got the space. And this next one is only 7 lines long. There's the break after it. We'll look at those 7 lines. and call it enough for one session. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding, wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman. But who is that on the other side of you? This is the Mystery Man passage. There's a third. Now, Eliot gives us a note about Shackelford exploring the Antarctic, and that it was so brutally cold there. And if you've never gotten down to minus 23 degrees in Chicago or minus 28 in Duluth, you can't know what very cold is, but Antarctica is way beyond that. The cold is so numbing that it numbs the mind, and often his men were reporting seeing extra people who weren't there. That's one way to look at it. And since Eliot tells us about that, we have a mind to it. And psychologists use this to talk about a state of mind of not knowing whether one is dreaming something or something actually happened in reality. So it's a psychological weak state of mind. And remember why Eliot is in Switzerland. He's got this weak state of mind, this burdened state of mind. If you remember that as backdrop to what we've just looked with all the crescendos and the crashes, state of mind. But there's also another reference here, and Eliot gives us that too. The journey to Emmaus. Emmaus is a town about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And that's where Jesus' disciples were on the day of, or went on the day of crucifixion. And the 11 of them, because Judas had committed suicide, the 11 of them are talking about what's happened. And 2 of them take a walk for a couple of hours up to Jerusalem and then come back. But on this walk, they constantly think there is a third person next to them. And they don't recognize this person, so the person perhaps was hooded. And the person says, you know, what's going on these days? Haven't you heard? Jesus was crucified. They don't realize they're walking next to Jesus, who has come back to spend some time with them. They get to Jerusalem, they break bread, and Jesus, perhaps he throws off the hood to break bread, and he blesses them, and they realize it's Jesus, and then he disappears. And the 2 disciples make their way back to the rest of the 11 and tell them about it. So the third who walks beside you could be Jesus after the crucifixion. And we had perhaps the crucifixion in the opening 9 lines. But I look ahead up the white road. There's always another one walking beside you. But we can't see them. Remind you of anyone? Remember Madame Sosostris and her pack of tarot cards? And this one has a burden on his back which I am not permitted to see. I do not know whether man or woman. Remember the hooded, because we're going to have next time some hooded hordes. But who is that on the other side of you? A question of faith? A question of, can you summon belief in the wasteland? Are you perhaps going crazy in the wasteland? You don't know the difference between dreams, visions, and reality? There we are. Where do we go from here? What is that sound? Well, we just had, who is the third? These are all questions. What is that sound? High in the air. Murmur of maternal lamentation. That passage we shall take up the next time. Hope you're back for it. Bye now.